Capitol erupts tonight as Trump's entire legal collapses in real time. 3 federal judges just united in a stunning rebuke that exposed his appeal as pure fiction. And what happened next sent shockwaves through Washington. His lawyers melting down, backing away from the podium, realizing the power of the court had finally turned against them. You could feel the chaos as the ruling hit. No delays, no escape, no more games. This wasn't a setback. This was the fall of a former president who thought he was untouchable. And inside the Supreme Court, a move is coming that will change everything. Stay right here.
Got some breaking news just now on the central economic policy of this Trump administration. In a huge blow to the White House and its agenda, and a big win, I would say, for everyone else, a federal appeals court has just ruled that Trump's sprawling tariffs are unlawful and invalid. Of course, the president has been obsessed with imposing his willy-nilly tariffs on Americans. In fact, it has been the central plank of his entire economic agenda. Now, it has been wildly unpopular. It's polling underwater. It is costing consumers and corporations billions and billions of dollars by the day. It's stopping the Fed from cutting interest rates by driving inflation. It has, on the whole, been really bad economic policy. And most of the discussion of these tariffs have been focused on that. But there's also something about these tariffs, which is that from the jump, they've been pretty clearly illegal.
You know, there's a moment in every presidency where the story stops being about charisma, rallies, slogans, and starts being about something a lot colder and a lot more unforgiving. The record, what you did, how you abused power, who paid the price. With Donald Trump, we're finally seeing that moment arrive in the one place he spent his entire life trying to dodge, the courtroom. Not just one courtroom, not just one case, but a network of judges, panels, and appeals courts, slowly closing in and saying, you don't get to live outside the law forever. This latest appeals court decision on his tariffs is a perfect example of that shift. For years, those tariffs were sold as toughness, as America first, as some kind of patriotic sacrifice we all just had to accept. What they really were was a president rewiring the economy by fiat, using emergency powers as a cheat code to bypass Congress and rewrite trade policy on his own. And now a federal appeals court steps in and basically says, no, that's not how this works. That's not what the Constitution says. You took a law meant for genuine emergencies and twisted it into a permanent power grab. Let's pause on that, because it's bigger than trade. When a court calls your use of emergency power unlawful, when it labels your appeal meritless, when it points to bad faith or concealment, that's not a policy disagreement. That's a judgment about character and about respect for the rule of law. It's the judicial system saying, this wasn't just a mistake. This was an abuse. For ordinary people, that abuse showed up in quiet, painful ways. It showed up in higher prices at the store. It showed up in small businesses trying to source parts, raw materials, inventory, and suddenly paying more because one man decided he could run the entire global economy through executive orders.
Frame the argument that you made and what the court said about those arguments.
Yeah, so I want to begin, Chris, by saying, like you started by saying it's a blow to the President Trump. The way I really think of it is it's a win for the Constitution. And it's always, a very serious, sober thing when you challenge presidential action, and something you have to do really carefully. But when we looked at this, and I'm privileged to represent a number of small businesses, we looked at it and said, look, this just is way beyond the constitutional pale. And that's what the 7 judges today said on our nation's second highest court. They looked at it and said, the president under our Constitution is given no power to impose tariffs. Our founders expressly gave that to the Congress in Article 1, Section 8.
That's the thing about these so-called strongman moves. The strongman almost never feels the pain. You do. Legally. What Trump tried to do was stretch a statute designed to deal with real national security threats, war, terrorist attacks, genuine crises, and turn it into a permanent excuse to tax imports however he wanted. That's not just aggressive. That's the president acting like the legislature doesn't matter, like Article 1 is optional, like he alone gets to define what counts as an emergency. The appeals court's answer was simple. No, you don't. That power belongs to Congress. That's the design. You can't pretend a law means whatever you say it means because you're frustrated with a trade deficit or you want a campaign talking point. And once one court says that out loud, a lot of other things start to change because judges talk to each other, not directly, but through their rulings. When one panel writes, in black and white, that Trump's arguments are meritless and that his team acted in bad faith, that becomes part of the story every other court sees. Suddenly, he's not just a controversial politician. He's a repeat player whose legal defenses keep collapsing the minute they run into an honest judge. We've seen this movie before, in different forms. Look at the defamation case with E. Jean Carroll. A jury listened to the evidence, weighed the testimony, and hit Trump with a massive damages award. Then, unsurprisingly, his team tried to wriggle out of it on appeal, leaning on arguments about immunity, about timing, about technicalities. And what did the appeals court say there? Essentially, no, you don't get to smear a woman who accused you of sexual assault and then hide behind the office you once held. You don't get retroactive immunity for personal attacks. You don't get a special shield because your name was on the door of the Oval Office at the time. That's not just a victory for one plaintiff. It's a message to every powerful person watching. The legal system still has a backbone, at least in some places. You're not untouchable just because your rallies are loud. Now, it would be dishonest to pretend the picture is completely clean or that every court has been a fortress of principle. We've seen decisions, especially at the Supreme Court, that carved out dangerously broad notions of presidential immunity for so-called official acts. That ruling scared a lot of constitutional scholars, and it should scare anyone who cares about democracy, because it opens the door to future abuses by presidents who learn the wrong lesson, that if you can classify an action as official, you might never face criminal consequences for it. But that's exactly why these newer rulings at the appeals level matter so much. They're a form of resistance inside the system. They're lower courts saying, no, we're not going to turn every abuse of power into an official act and pretend we're powerless. We're going to read the facts, apply the law, and call out deception when we see it. This tension between parts of the system that are drifting toward protecting power and parts that are rediscovering their duty to check it is the real story right now. And Trump is at the center of it because he spent his entire career stress testing every weak point in American institutions. Think about his pattern. When judges give him an inch, he takes a mile. When Congress hesitates, he barrels through. When agencies try to enforce ethics rules, he replaces people until the rules don't matter. When the media calls him out, he brands the whole industry the enemy of the people. And when the legal system tries to hold him accountable, his instinct isn't to answer the charges. It's to delay, obstruct, appeal, stall, to weaponize the slowness of the courts as a shield. For a long time, that worked. Lawsuits dragged on for years. Investigations stalled. Key witnesses were intimidated or bought off. Even when he lost, he managed to turn those losses into political fuel, playing the victim, telling his supporters that every subpoena, every indictment, every ruling was just proof of a vast conspiracy against them. But there's a limit. There's a point where judges stop granting extensions, where appeals run out, where we're still litigating this, morphs into you've lost and now the consequences begin. That's the phase we're entering now, not because the system is suddenly perfect, but because enough individual judges in enough specific cases are saying, we are not going to be props in your political theater. We are not here to validate your narrative. We are here to apply the law. That's why the language in these rulings is so important. Words like meritless, bad faith, unlawful, they add up. They pierce the myth that Trump is some kind of master strategist, always 3 steps ahead. Instead, they paint a picture of a man who keeps bringing flimsy arguments into serious courts and expecting deference he hasn't earned. And it's not just about him. It's about the entire MAGA movement, which has been built on the idea that institutions only matter when they serve the leader. If a court rules in Trump's favor, it's proof that he was right all along. If a court rules against him, the court is corrupt. The judge is biased. The jury is rigged. The process is weaponized. That's authoritarian thinking. That's the mindset you see in countries where the courts eventually get purged, where prosecutors become personal bodyguards for the leader, where laws are written not to constrain power, but to wrap it in legal-sounding language. The good news, and it is good news, is that the United States hasn't fully gone there. Not yet. We still have independent judges willing to call out abuse. We still have juries willing to hit a powerful man with verdicts he doesn't like. We still have plaintiffs willing to show up, put their names on lawsuits, and endure the backlash because they believe the truth matters more than his threats. But here's the thing. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people insist on it. Small businesses that challenged those tariffs, they had to decide to step up, to spend time and money and energy confronting a sitting president's policy in court. A woman like E. Jean Carroll, she had to withstand years of public attacks, online smears, and character assassination just to win a ruling saying, yes, what he did was wrong, and no, he can't pretend it was part of his job. So when we talk about the courts pushing back, we're really talking about a partnership. Citizens willing to challenge power and judges willing to listen. The stakes couldn't be higher, because if Trump's approach had been vindicated, if he'd been allowed to stretch emergency powers without constraint, to use immunity as a magic eraser for personal wrongdoing, to turn every legal setback into just another delay, that would send a devastating message to every future president. Go ahead, try it. The guardrails are soft. The courts will blink. Instead, what these rulings say is there are still lines you cannot cross. No matter how many rallies you hold, or how many times cable news says your name, you can't invent emergencies to dodge Congress. You can't call every smear an official act. You can't treat the legal system like a reality show where you control the edit. There's also a cultural shift happening here that's worth paying attention to. For years, Trump sold himself as a winner in business, in politics, in court. Every indictment was supposedly falling apart. Every lawsuit was going great. Every prosecutor was totally discredited. Now, that narrative is cracking. He's losing in front of real judges. He's paying real money in damages. He's facing real deadlines he can't move. Even some of his supporters are quietly asking why this constant winning looks so much like losing when you read the actual rulings. That's important, because authoritarian movements are built not just on fear, but on the illusion of inevitability. The idea that he always comes out on top is part of the spell. Break that spell. Show that the law actually can bring consequences, and you weaken the grip he has on people who've been told over and over that he's above the rules the rest of us live under. None of this means the danger is gone. Trump still has a hold on a major political party. He still has millions of people who see every indictment as a badge of honor. He still has allies in Congress, in media, even on some courts, who will twist themselves into knots to excuse whatever he does. But the difference now is that there's a counterweight. There are judges writing opinions that actually defend the Constitution, instead of bending it around one man's ego. There are juries saying, in dollar figures, we believe the evidence, not the spin. There are prosecutors in different jurisdictions reading these rulings and thinking, okay, the door is open to move forward. When we say his reign is ending, we're not talking about one dramatic day where he's marched out of the Capitol in handcuffs while everyone cheers. That's not how real systems work. What we're talking about is a slow, grinding end to the idea that he can endlessly stall, endlessly appeal, endlessly lie, and never face the consequences. It's the end of the aura of impunity, the end of the assumption that he'll always find a friendly judge, or an activist Supreme Court, or some new legal gimmick to slither out of accountability. In a healthy democracy, that wouldn't be a radical statement. It would be normal. The law applies to everyone. Presidents have power, but not unlimited power. Courts interpret the law. They don't worship the executive. We've drifted so far from that basic reality that watching judges simply do their jobs feels almost revolutionary. So what do we do with that? How do we respond to this moment where the legal system is finally starting to push back? First, we tell the truth about what's happening. We don't tune out because the word tariff sounds boring. We don't shrug at legal jargon like meritless and unlawful. We translate it. This is a court saying the president broke the rules and tried to pretend it was legal. Second, we stop letting anyone, Trump, his allies, his media echo chamber, convince us that accountability is the same thing as persecution. Holding a powerful person responsible for what they did isn't a witch hunt. It's the bare minimum standard for a functioning republic. And third, we remember that the courts are not the only battlefield, but they are a crucial one. Voting rights, free speech, reproductive freedom, basic equality, all of those fights pass through courts sooner or later. When you see judges willing to stand up to a figure as loud and aggressive as Trump, that's a sign those institutions might still be salvageable if we keep supporting them, funding them, and demanding they work for everyone, not just the well-connected. The bottom line is this: Donald Trump built a political brand on the idea that he was bigger than the system. Too rich to be constrained by laws, too famous to be held to basic standards, too strong to ever bow to a judge in a robe. These recent rulings on tariffs, on defamation, on the limits of presidential power are the system quietly answering back. No, you're not bigger than this. No matter how loud your movement is, no matter how many times you shout witch hunt, no matter how many talking heads swear you're untouchable. In the long run, that's what will matter. Not the tweets, not the rallies, not even the news cycles. What will matter is whether the legal record shows that when a president tried to step outside the law still pushed back. Right now, despite all the damage, despite all the cynicism, we're seeing proof that it can. And that's not just a story about Trump. That's a story about whether this country still recognizes the difference between a leader and a ruler, between a president and a king. If we care about democracy, we hold on to that and we push it further. Because this moment, this slow, grinding end of one man's reign of impunity is only the beginning of rebuilding a system where no one ever again thinks they can sit above the law and get away with it.